All right, so I come about this a little bit different perspective. For one thing, I don't have doctor in front of my name, and I really don't know a heck of a lot about wearables. Until a couple of years ago, I didn't know anything at all. But the association that I work for, it is AATCC, and we represent the entire textile industry. Part of my job is to bring together the experts from all over the industry and have them come together and make some decisions, in particular about the test methods, the things that we use to evaluate whether it's the shrinkage of your clothes or the performance of your wearables. So I'm learning together an awful lot about wearables. And what's really interesting is one of the first questions that came up, one of the things that was a really heated discussion was around the word wearables, around this vocabulary. So I borrowed this graphic from a newsletter article that AATCC published a couple months ago. And so I work in this textiles area, this big red circle. And a lot of the folks here today probably work in this big green circle of wearables. And they don't completely overlap, but they're starting to. So a lot of what we think about as wearables are these Fitbits, these watches, pendants, things like that, hard goods. But we're starting to see some overlap into actual textiles, things that you can wear directly on your body, things that can go in the wash. And then even within textiles, we have smart textiles, and we have things like phase change materials that are smart, but that aren't necessarily an electronic textile. Then we have electronic textiles that maybe aren't wearable per se. We might use the word wearables, but it might be a smart carpet. It might be a bus seat that helps the driver know to turn left or turn right. And so we had a lot of discussion around this conversation. Wearables is a hot word, but it's not quite the right word to describe what we're working on. We're specifically working in the e-textile space, in which there is definitely some overlap. So like I said, this was a heated discussion. What we didn't have any question about was the first test method that we needed to do. So if anybody knows anything about wearables, if you're talking about garments, whether it's socks or shirts or bras or whatever, they're going to have to be laundered. And people who make electronics don't like to see their things get wet, and they don't like to see them spinning around at 180 revolutions per minute. And so this is a big deal. And so we need to figure out a standard way of testing this so that if you, as a startup company, want to go to market, you can say, yes, I can tell you this meets AATCC test method 217, and everybody knows what that means instead of having to test separately for each vendor. So this is the first test method that we're working on in wearables, is for laundering, because across the board is the first thing that people ask us about. It's actually how we got into the wearable space, and I go to conferences all over the country, and this is what people are worried about, is how are we going to launder these things? Can we launder these things? Once we move past this, there's other kind of interesting ideas that we can work on. What about perspiration? In some cases, that's what you're using to do the sensing. So that's great. We want perspiration to be in contact with the sensors. But what if it's not? What effect might the perspiration have on your components, on your connectors, on all of these things that go into making your electronics work? And what are the long-term effects? It might be okay to be in contact temporarily, but if it's long-term, if it sits and dries or sits and then goes into the wash, what happens there? And then other kinds of contact is exposure to sunlight over a long period of time an issue, is stretching an issue, is bending an issue. All of these things that, we can have some really great technology, but if it's not usable as a wearable, as a garment, it really doesn't do us much good. And so then one of the other things that's really important is hand and the aesthetics. And so Mike mentioned about making things disappear. And this actually surprised me, but I've heard this from both sides, from the folks on the textile side and the folks on the electronic side. In the long run, these e-textiles are going to have invisible technology. They have to be a beautiful garment that you would go to the store and purchase based on its look and feel, and gee, how nice, it also does something special. It senses something, it lights up, it does something, but it has to be attractive as a textile. And so if we take a garment, put a bunch of wires and connectors and sensors and things on it, and all of a sudden it becomes very difficult to wear or not so nice to look at, people aren't going to use it. And so across the board, we're hearing that the technology needs to disappear. We need to keep the hand. And so there's test methods for this too. How do you measure the hand, the feel of a garment? How do you measure that the color, the drapeability, all those aesthetics are still there? And so that's another area that we're looking at. And that actually is just about where I'm ending. So we definitely want to be thinking about the textiles and the electronics, but we've got to figure out how to get it all together and still have a good product.